So tonight, I bring you the story of the Sodder Children. Now, with that being said, and of course, as always, without further ado, let's get into tonight's story, shall we? Alright, so our story begins just outside Fayetteville, West Virginia, on the night before Christmas in 1945. So a while ago, but not too long ago, right? So George Sodder Sr. and his wife Jeannie, they had recently purchased a new home just outside Fayetteville. The Sodders, they had 10 children, which, in and of itself is an accomplishment, don't you think? I mean, can you imagine having 10 children? Because I can't. Now, George Sr. was a 50-year-old Italian immigrant, and he had recently launched a new coal trucking firm from his home, which was doing well, so, good job, George. Now, it was doing so well that 2 of his children also worked for him at the firm. Now, these kids were John, who was 23 years old, and George Jr., who was 16. One of his sons was in the army, but it's 1945. The World War had just ended, the second one, and that was 4 months prior, so he was now safe and he was no longer in danger. So for the Sodder family, life was sweet and the future bright. So, it's Christmas Eve, 1945. The children had opened their presents. Now, these presents included toys bought by their 17-year-old daughter, Marion, from a job that she had in the Fayetteville Times store. And it's just really wholesome that she bought the toys for her siblings with her own money that she had earned working at the Times store. So everything was going great on this particular Christmas Eve, and George Sr. decided to have an early night, and he went to bed first, followed by the children. Now, 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 10-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 6-year-old Betty, they kind of protested their bedtime. They didn't want to go to bed yet, which, children do that kind of thing. But then finally, at 10 p.m., they gave in and they went to bed. Now, Jeannie Sodder took her 2-year-old daughter Sylvia to bed with her, anticipating a good night's sleep. But a good night's sleep is not what they would receive. Jeannie got woken up the first time shortly after midnight by a ringing telephone in George's office downstairs. Now, personally, if I was woken up by a ringing telephone at midnight, I would never in a million years go to pick that up. But apparently, obviously tired. That wasn't the last time Jeannie got woken up from her sleep, though. Another 30 minutes later, she was awoken a final time, now by the smell of smoke. Now, this was obviously not something that Jeannie felt she could ignore, so she got up to find out where it was coming from. Can I just say, Jeannie is such an independent woman. Why is she not waking up George at any point during this? I don't understand. Now, as she left the bedroom to investigate, Jeannie found flames spreading quickly through her husband's ground floor office. She didn't waste any time. She rushed back to the master bedroom, finally woke up George Sr., and they both shouted towards the other bedrooms on the second floor and towards the attic to wake their children up. George and Jeannie thought that they heard their children answer, so they carried on, getting everything out of the house. Now, George Sr., Jeannie, John, George Jr., Marion, and little Sylvia made it out of the house safely with their parents. But sadly and oddly enough, the other 5 children never exited the home. Now, when I was researching this, I was kind of thinking, they had 10 kids, and 4 children managed to escape the house, and, obviously the parents as well. But then they say there's 5 kids still in the house, which would bring the total to 9, right? So I kind of don't know where the 10th went, unless the 10th child is the one who was in the army, and he actually didn't come home for Christmas, and he kind of stayed in the army, and that's why he's not mentioned again. So I think that's what it is. Now, at any rate, the children who didn't make it out of the burning house were Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, which are the same children who were previously kicking off about their bedtime, if you remember. Now, understandably so, George Sr. was now frantic. In an attempt to rescue the other children from the burning house, he re-entered it, which, that takes balls. Let's be honest, entering a burning house, that takes balls. So he re-entered it, but he found the only staircase in the house engulfed in flames. Now, this obviously meant that he couldn't rescue the kids from within the house, so he then tried it a different way, and he went around the house outside, hoping to help the 5 remaining children exit through their bedroom windows, which was a smart idea had it not been for the fact that the ladder that George Sr. usually kept propped up against the side of the house was missing. It was gone. By the way, about that ladder, so later, after all of this had transpired, the Sodders actually found this ladder 75 feet from the house, thrown down an embankment. They never found out who did it, but obviously that has something to do with the fire, right? It can't not have something to do with that. It's too suspicious. So, he couldn't use the ladder, but George Sr. was not about to give up. He wasn't about to let his children perish, which I understand. So he then tried to drive one of his coal trucks up to the house, and he was planning to assist them. Because obviously in that time, in 1945, when you wanted to phone somebody, then you had to speak to a telephone operator first, and they would connect you to the person you wanted to reach. But when they used the neighbour's phone, they didn't manage to speak to anyone. Strange, right? Now, at 1 a.m, an hour after Jeannie was first woken up by the telephone, another neighbour who passed by the scene saw the blaze, and he drove off to use a nearby tavern's telephone. Again, no operator responded, but this neighbour, bless him, he was not about to give up. So he drove all the way into town, into Fayetteville, and he finally managed to get Chief of the Fire Department, F.J. Morris, on the line. Now, he's quite the character, as you will find out during this story. So the next bit is absolutely outrageous, right? Are you ready? So, this neighbour spoke to the chief of the fire department, and he told him about the fire going on at the Sodders' house, right? But even then, the firefighters didn't arrive on the scene until 8 a.m. What? There's an entire working day in between. So this neighbour manages to speak to Chief Morris at 1 a.m. and the firefighters don't arrive until 8. What? Now the reason for this is even more outrageous, right? So their excuse for it was that because of World War II that had just ended, the department manpower was depleted. And apparently the chief, the actual chief of the fire department, could not drive Fayetteville's fire truck. What? The literal chief of the fire department could not drive the fire truck. That is outrageous. Can I just point out that it took them 7 hours to get there? They could have probably pushed the bloody truck there like 3 times over. What? That is wild. Wild. So, needless to say, by the time that they had found somebody who could drive the bloody fire truck, and they had reached the Sodder house, it had been reduced to a smoking, ash-filled basement. And so, ironically, they didn't even need the fire truck, because that entire house had already been burnt to a crisp. Now, George Sr. and Jeannie obviously assumed that the missing 5 children had died in the fire. Now, since they had no fire to extinguish, the fire department did a brief search of what was left of the Sodder family home. Now, this search ended at around 10 a.m. on Christmas Day, with Chief Morris telling the Sodders that no trace of the children was found. Now, Chief Morris, with his brilliant mind, basically suggested that the children had essentially been cremated by the fire, and that's why no trace of them could be found. What was left of the Sodder family was then urged to leave the premises to await a more thorough search. George Sr. apparently waited 4 entire days for this thorough search, but then eventually he just got a bulldozer and he covered the basement with 5 feet of accidental. Right, accidental. And they blamed it on faulty wiring. Easy enough, just say it's accidental and then you don't have to spend money and resources into finding out what actually happened. This is even more outrageous. So, they decided this fire was accidental, and on the 30th of December, they just issued death certificates for these 5 missing children. Job done. Okay, now with today's science, we know that the fire, which leveled the Sodder home in roughly half an hour, never reached the temperature that's required for the obliteration of human remains. Now, total cremation, like what Chief Morris was talking about, would take 2 to 3 hours at 1,400 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this did not happen. In fact, there were various household appliances that were found in the burned out basement that was still recognizable. They would have definitely been completely destroyed if the fire had met those requirements. Then there was the matter of the telephone not being picked up by the operator. A telephone lineman was summoned to the site to investigate why no operator, picked up. He investigated what went wrong there, and he found that the phone line was not burned through, but had been intentionally cut 14 feet above the ground and 2 feet from the nearest utility pole. Now then, there's always the nosy neighbours who sometimes provide very useful information. So, these nosy neighbours, they had seen a man at the scene of the fire removing an automotive block and tackle, which I didn't know what that was, so I looked it up, and it's basically one of those chains with hooks on either end that you use to pull a car with another car. So the police actually found this man and they questioned him, and he admitted to stealing the block and tackle and to cutting the phone line, but he denied having anything to do with the fire. He said that he cut the phone line because he had mistaken it for a power line, but his motives for cutting it in the first place remain unknown. Now, even though the coroner had deemed this fire as accidental, a bus driver came forward and he said that he had witnessed unknown persons throwing, quote, balls of fire onto the Sodders roof, which, suspicious, right? Balls of fire. Now, in March 1946, so that's about 3 months after the fire, Sylvia Sodder, the little one, if you remember, she found a green, hard rubber object near the ruins of the house. Now, I'm assuming that she found this while playing, considering that she's only 2 years old, but it was believed that this was part of a fire bomb, which could explain the balls of fire, right? Balls of fire. Then, of course, like in any missing persons case, the sightings began to Sodders had been threatened in October of 1945 by a guy who lived in Fayetteville and was trying to sell them life insurance. The Sodders rejected his offer and he allegedly got real mad because they rejected it, and he said that their house would, quote, go up in smoke, which is a threat enough, don't you think? Now, this part is a bit strange, but he also allegedly said that the children would be, quote, destroyed over, quote, dirty remarks that George Sr. had allegedly made about Benito Mussolini. What? Now, for those of you who don't know who that is, Mussolini was Italy's fascist dictator who was lynched in April of 1945. Now, it's strange to me that some random guy who was selling them life insurance would then threaten them because of a comment about Mussolini. Like, what's Mussolini got to do with any of this? The only thing I can imagine is that that guy who was selling insurance was probably also Italian and a supporter of Mussolini, whereas George was not. Something along those lines, but it's still very random to me. Now, it may or may not be a coincidence, but this same guy had been a member of the coroner's jury that deemed the fire at the Sodder house accidental. Odd. Now then, in 1947, a vicar from Fayetteville spilled the tea about Chief Morris. So, initially, I'm going to refresh your memory. Chief Morris had claimed that no remains were found at the fire scene in 1945. We all remember that, right? Well, apparently, he privately claimed that he had found something. Not just something, a hat, apparently. A human hat in the ashes. That's what he found. That's what he claimed he found. Alright? Weird. You know, weird that the chief of the fire department wouldn't report this. That's odd, right? So supposedly, he, and this is according to himself, right? He placed the hat in a dynamite box and he buried it at the scene without reporting it. Now, after some persuasion from private investigator Tinsley and George Jr., they all got together, went to the scene of the fire and dug the box up. They took the box straight to a funeral home and they asked the person who was in charge there to open the box and examine what was in it. Now, when this person opened the box, he found something that didn't look like a human heart, but it looked like fresh beef liver. After being underground for 2 years, like Chief Morris is claiming, the organ, whether it be a heart or a liver, could hardly be fresh anymore, right? It was later reported that the organ found in the box was in fact beef liver, untouched by the fire. So, Morris had some stinky business going on, that's for certain. My question is, why in hell would this chief of the fire department firstly lie about finding a hat, but then when he realizes that he's been caught in a lie, he went to the butcher, he bought fresh beef liver, put it in a dynamite box and buried it? Like, why? To seem interesting, like, see a picture in there of several New York schoolgirls. Now, as he was looking at it, he was absolutely convinced that one of the girls in the photo was his daughter Betty, right? He was so convinced, in fact, that he drove all the way to Manhattan and demanded to see the child. Now, when George got there, the parents of the girl that he thought was Betty, they wouldn't let him see the child, which I can kind of wrap my head around. So George just kind of went back, disappointed. Now, then in 1949, Tinsley and the Sodders decided to do a new search at the scene of the fire, and they discovered something. They discovered 4 human vertebrae, so bits of spine, right? Now, of course, they reported their discovery to the police, but the police showed no intention to examine the discovery, so Tinsley, of his own back, sent it off to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Now, they did examine the vertebrae, and they concluded that they had come from a male between the ages of 9 and 22. So now you're probably thinking they might be from one of the children, right? But they had not been exposed to fire. Alright, so they had been placed there. Now, Tinsley then wanted to find out where these bones had come from and how they had ended up at the scene of the fire. Now, he was able to trace the bones back to the cemetery in Mount Hope, West Virginia, but he couldn't find out exactly which grave they had come from or why they were placed at the scene of the fire in the first place. Again, this is all very strange. Almost seems like someone is trying to play tricks on the family. Now, honestly, personally, I wouldn't even be surprised if it was Chief Morris again after, the stunt that he pulled with the beef liver. I still can't get over that. Now, because of the Smithsonian report, the FBI actually started to investigate the Sodder case, and they investigated it as a possible interstate kidnapping in 1950. But 2 years later, they closed the case and they didn't make any progress whatsoever. So, because they still hadn't found their children and nothing seemed to be done about it, the family had a billboard put up in 1952, and they put it near Anstead, West Virginia, and it was a billboard with photographs of the missing children and a $5,000 reward for information that could lead to the recovery of the kids. Nothing ever came of this, and you gotta keep in mind that in that time, $5,000 was worth a lot more than what it would be in today's money. But nothing came of this, and those billboards actually stood there until Jeannie died. That's when they took them down, so they stood there for many years. Now, of course, there were rumours. There's always rumours, and there were many rumours. And these rumours included tales of Italian fascists, mafiosi, and child-snatching orphanage wardens. But there never came a break in the case, and the disappearance of the Sodder children remains unsolved to this day. Now, Sylvia, if you remember, the youngest Sodder child who survived, she actually kept the hope alive ask me, there's a lot of corruption involved. I mean, this Chief Morris, he's a weird character, isn't he? I still don't understand why he hid a beef liver on the fire site, like on the scene of the fire. That still does not compute. At any rate, it's an incredibly strange story, but I had so much fun researching this and telling you the story of the Sodder Children. I hope you enjoyed it, and I would love to read all you guys' opinions in the comments below. Thank you for choosing to hang out with me again this evening. For now though, all there is left for me to do is to wish you a very, 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 very good night. Good night. Sleep